Section 1 of G.K. Chesterton in the Bibliophile Magazine. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Read by Larry Wilson. G.K. Chesterton in the Bibliophile Magazine by G.K. Chesterton. W. E. Henley, Poet. The changes that pass over great societies are often too big to be seen. That is, they are too big to be summarized under a public name. But it is a gross mistake to suppose that each of them is not felt as a private fact. Every man feels the faith or the sin, but every man feels it as something peculiar to himself. It is the most secret part of every separate man that makes up a real social movement. The general philosophy is drawn not from what everybody says, but rather from what everybody does not say, but feels the more. Public opinion is made up of all the most peculiarly private opinions. Hence we always find a paradox in the fashion of speech and thought. The changes which men in any age are always talking about are never the changes that are really going on. The changes that are really going on are not those which men pompously applaud when they get together, but those which they vigorously promote when they get by themselves. For instance, England was turned from an agricultural to a commercial country, while people were talking publicly about things quite different, chiefly about whether Charles I's head ought to have been cut off. Lord John Manners and his Young England Company, when they tried to revive agricultural England, were like that other nobleman, Lord Tomnoddy and his Young England Company, who woke up after the man had been hanged. But because the change came privately, do not suppose that it came unconsciously. On the contrary, it was quite specially conscious because it was quite specially private. Every man was publicly interested in Charles I's head, but every man was privately interested in making money at any cost. And the mad factory chimneys we see rising everywhere, and the monstrous cities in which we walk have been created, not by their public speeches, but by their private thoughts. Now, in the whole literature in the later 19th century, there was an analogous process, a process which every man felt inside himself, and which was yet not much mentioned in the many open debates about art. The change, I think, was this, that every literary man began consciously to consider himself as a character in a play. He exaggerated his own oddities because he had to conflict with other and opposite oddities. He was the black spot in the picture. Someone else was the white. In all the most striking writers of our own time, one can feel this picturesque and partisan quality, this quality which assumes the existence of dialogue and of different figures. One can feel it, for instance, in Mr. Rudyard Kipling and Mr. Bernard Shaw. One can feel the floodlights at their feet. Nothing could be more different from this than the old, especially the medieval, conception of the function of a man. The medievals believed that one man should have in his head the balance of the whole universe, a smaller cosmos, but still a cosmos. The medievals thought that a man should have inside his skull a little sun and a little moon, and yet littler stars, all drawn justly and to scale. Every man should have the equipoise of everything. There must be no conscious pitting of red against green, according to the medievals. Every man, as far as his intellect went, must be perfect, even as his Father in heaven was perfect. The last of the medievals in England was Herbert Spencer. The modern literary method, that of exaggerating one's own peculiarities, as if one were playing in a farce, gave the world a number of arresting and exciting personalities. Its great defect, however, was this, that it tended to give many men quite false personalities. I mean that even great men sometimes took so totally wrong a view of themselves that much of their work was wasted. They preferred their own masks to their own faces. They painted themselves so fiercely for the floodlights that they concealed their own original good looks. It is only these men who had real reputations to spoil, and spoilt them, who are of any interest in literary history. We need not concern ourselves with mere imbeciles and impostors. We are not troubled about mere asses in a lion's skin. The only interesting cases are just those 2 or 3 cases of one lion dressing up in the skin of another. One of these curious cases is that of the late W. E. Henley. He was a man who really suffered from the histrionic habit which has grown gradually on men of letters. He was a man of large heart who deliberately narrowed his heart. He was a man of large brain who deliberately narrowed his brain. He was a man thoroughly by nature a poet, who forced himself against all his own emotional trend to be a boisterous and topical ballad-monger. The critics of the future will have to take a great deal of trouble to extricate the real Henley from under the heavy accretions of the fictitious or dramatic Henley. But they will take the trouble, for they will be digging up gold. No critic will ever be accused of misrepresenting Henley. The only man who misrepresented Henley was Henley himself. If we read those poems in which Henley was striking a deep note, as distinct from those in which he was thumping a tin kettle, we shall not find it at all difficult, without having ever known him, to say what kind of man he was. He was a sad, sensitive, and tender-hearted pessimist, who endured pain that came from nowhere, and enjoyed pleasure that came from nowhere, with the exquisite appreciation of some timid child in Maeterlinck's plays. He was not so much a Stoic as a tragic Epicurean, but he had this truly sublime quality in the highest type of Epicurean, that he enjoyed a pleasure so much that it reconciled him even to pain. He certainly believed, in his soul, that the rule of the universe was bad, but his glory was that he was ready to accept the rule for the sake of the exceptions. He enjoyed a red rose so poignantly and perfectly that he was ready to go through thorns for it, even though it was only an accident of the tree and not its crown. His poetry rose to its noblest height when he spoke of the strange joy of having snatched some good from an evil world. This led him to dwell much upon the past, and to him memory was a kind of intoxication. Neither he nor anyone else ever wrote anything much better or more real in its own way than those lines about things already secured. What is to come we know not, but we know that what has been was good to show better to hide the best of all to bear. We are the masters of the days that were. We have lived, we have loved, we have suffered, even so. Shall we not take the ebb who had the flow? Life was our friend. Now, if it be our foe, dear, though it spoil and break us, need we care what is to come? That is the true Henley, and as I have said, it is not very difficult to understand him. He was what every poet must be who shares the unbelief of our age, a man melancholy, though not without happiness, a man reconciled to a second best. A poet who has lost his gods must always be like a lover who has lost his love and has married a sensible woman. For the earth which Henley enjoyed has never been the original starting point of men's thoughts or labors. Heaven was man's first love, and the earth is only a substitute, even when it is not only a marriage of convenience. Unfortunately, in his lifetime, and especially in his later years, Henley hid himself behind the mask of what he thought he ought to stand for. Somebody told him, or he somehow got into his head, that he was the representative of rude energy and militant empire. His talents were entirely in the other direction. So far from specializing in strength, he describes in most penetrating poems a condition of beautiful weakness. So far from being by nature a prophet of the British Empire, he had not the temperament to be a prophet of his own town or street. He did not believe in them enough. He did not believe much in anything. There were some things, it is true, which he definitely disbelieved in. He certainly had a sincere hatred for democracy and for Christian morals. But positive beliefs involve a certain simple fixity of the intellect which was not at all a part of his personality. He did not really believe even in the stone of the street or the stars in the sky, but he had this strange quality of a great imagination about him, that he could enjoy things even without believing in them. This quite false conception of himself as a raw head and bloody bones produced a crop of poems which are not in Henley's good manner or even in his bad manner. They are not in Henley's manner at all. It would be untrue to say that Henley was ever a hypocrite, but some of his poems are hypocritical. The Song of the Sword is, I am afraid, hypocritical. It is all about the Lord and the sword, two things that Henley knew nothing whatever about. Of the sword he had no grasp or experience, and in the Lord he didn't believe. The heavy Old Testament manner of the whole thing was utterly alien to his true nature, which was sensitive and modern, exquisitely attuned to pleasure and to pain. He was not a solemn youth like David. He was an Epicurean invalid. A man more unmilitary cannot be conceived. If he had ever held a sword in his hand, he would have been filled either with pain at having to inflict wounds, or with pleasure in inflicting them. Both these emotions are feminine and unsoldierly. And the most painful evidence of all his unfitness for such topics can be found in this, that when he was attempting to be specially masculine, he always came near to that most unmasculine of all ideas, cruelty. But it is not with the false Henley, but the true Henley, that the world will deal. He caused his own exquisite voice to be drowned in the clamor of his own quite fictitious reputation as a sort of political ruffian. He drowned his own voice with his own drum. But anyone who cares today to take up one of his books of poems will suddenly find himself in an atmosphere utterly unexpected and very calm. He will break into a sudden stillness. He will read a few quiet poems about gray streets and silver sunsets. He will find that the poet has a peculiar power of describing the voiceless and neglected corners of a great city, the little grass-grown squares, the little streets that lead nowhere. The poet feels the loss of parts of London as more lost than the lost parts of the wilderness, and he loves them more. He has an almost eerie power of realizing certain aimless emotions of an empty afternoon. All will seem full of a kind of quiet irrelevance, and yet the very foundations of the reader's heart will be moved. The sadness will only seem an expression of the sacred value of things. And as he walks home at evening after reading such a book, every paving stone and lamp post will be pathetic because it is precious. Nay, the world will seem brittle because it is precious, and if it might be broken by accident. End of section 1. Section 2 of G.K. Chesterton in the Bibliophile Magazine. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Read by Larry Wilson. Why Books Become Popular. The question of why books are popular is much confused by certain phrases which are intended to be highly intellectual and fastidious, but which are in truth both vulgar and unreasonable. One of these, for instance, is to call the ordinary public stupid, an expression which is itself the quintessence of stupidity. Stupid, if it means anything, must mean an abnormal and notable deficiency of mind. It must be extraordinary, and to say that the ordinary man is extraordinarily stupid is a contradiction in terms. It is like saying that most men are below the middle height. The average cannot be below the average. If any critic says so, he must be below the intellectual average himself. Another expression of the same kind, which confounds the whole controversy, is that which refers to people as uneducated. It is not a piece of mere muddle-headedness, like the phrase stupid. Nevertheless, it is a mistake. The truth is that there are no people who are uneducated. There are only a large number of people who receive various forms of a thoroughly bad education. But no one is untaught, no one is untouched. There is no poor Indian with untutored mind. Some other and older Indian tutors his mind with a curiously curved stick. Every guttersnipe is learned. The only question, and that often a lurid one, is what he has learnt. Fagin was quite as much of an educationalist as Froebel. But the education given by Fagin is not the only kind of bad education, nor is it, in my opinion, the worst. For definite periods of history, whole classes of the community, upper and middle, as well as lower classes, may be steeped in some false philosophy or some inhuman routine. Between Bunyan and Wesley there must have been millions of children who grew up shuddering in the dark domesticity of Calvinism, in the real Puritan home where the devil is kept in the coal cellar. In the public schools of today there must be millions of boys growing up with the firm conviction that to be an English gentleman is to be a perfect man. These are thorough educations, and bad ones. Let us keep well in mind these two preliminary truisms. First, that the ordinary man is a man of ordinary human intelligence, or he would not be ordinary. Second, that this human intelligence has always received some cultivation, but unfortunately it is often an evil or unwise cultivation. Having got these obvious facts well in hand, we shall be free from all supercilious follies about the swinish multitude and the man in the street, and we may be able to attack with some profit or enlightenment the really difficult question of why bad books so often sell like hot cakes. We may dismiss the dandified nonsense which talks as if this principle were universal, as if good books always failed and bad books always succeeded. The divisions, of course, cut across each other. George Meredith is a great man, but so was Dickens. Mr. Frederick Wedmore is a clever and artistic writer, but not more clever and artistic than Mr. W. W. Jacobs. Some books are deservedly popular, some undeservedly. Some crude books are bought, thousands of crude books are not bought. But we will suppose that we have to deal here only with the crude books that are bought. There are certain novelists, notably Miss Corelli, Mr. Silas Hocking, and others, who undoubtedly satisfy millions of the public, but who cannot satisfy a strong literary taste. In so far as this fact is used as an attack on the novelists, I do not mind. They have put themselves forward, and they have their reward. But this fact is also used as an attack on the democracy, and I think some explanation ought to be given to the democratic preference in such things, even if it is not so much an explanation as a conjecture. It does not very much matter what we think of one individual lady known as Miss Marie Corelli, but it does very much matter what we think of the thousands of our fellow citizens who are reading her books. Like every good thing, democracy is always the object of a secret war. This perpetual disparagement of the public choice will eventually be used against political self-government, and men will invoke the circulating library to destroy the jury. There is one thing that ought clearly to be seen. It alters the whole landscape. You and I, as I may fairly infer from our writing in this paper or reading it, are bookish people. I purposely refuse to say educated people, because we are most probably quite uneducated about many other things, such as theology or gunnery or music, or horses or housekeeping, but we do know a great deal about books. And when we talk of a good book, we mean one in which all the parts fit together into a certain poetic harmony, just what the musician means when he talks about a good piece of music. But the mass of men, who are quite intelligent, do not buy books as if each book were a complete harmony, a small cosmos in which every part was perfect. To correlate and consider all the parts of a book would be as hard to them as sitting out the whole of a Wagner opera would be to me. I happen to be rather above the human average touching books and very much below it touching music. The ordinary man buys books in the most exact sense as goods. That is to say, his base commercial soul supposes simply that he can get some good out of them. Granted that good of some kind is embedded in the thing, he does not care where it is embedded, or whether it is properly related to the rest of the stuff. If the ordinary man steals a ring in which he knows there is a diamond, it will be in vain for the aesthete to assure him that the diamond is quite wrongly set in the ring. If the ordinary man buys an estate in which there is a gold mine, it will be useless for the landscape painter to assure him that the mine is in the wrong part of the landscape. If the goods are in the box, he does not care whether they are in harmony with the box. Now there are certain good things in a book that have no necessary connection at all with literary harmony. Take one example first. A riddle is an interesting thing quite apart from any literary quality in its form. When our nurse propounds to us the problem, "When I was going to St. Ives, I met a man with 7 wives," etc., we admire the riddle without necessarily admiring the poem. Now a whole department of popular fiction exists simply to give people riddles rather than romances. I mean the things commonly called detective stories. If the question is complex and the answer clever, the ordinary reader does not care whether the style is slipshod or the characters crude. And the ordinary reader is quite right. There is nothing in the least unintelligent in wanting the mere fun of seeing a puzzle pulled to pieces. Nor is there anything unintelligent in paying for what you want. He has as much right to prefer a puzzle in criminology to a study in human nature as I have to prefer a study in human nature to a problem in algebra. The point is that a love of puzzles exists, and men are justified in gratifying it either in mathematics or in murders. Now, I believe that the same explanation covers the cloudy religious novel which has been popularized by Miss Corelli and by Mr. Silas Hocking. The detective story is a development of our nursery riddles. The religious novel is the development of our nursery prayers. The very thing which makes such books bad as books is the very thing that makes them good as rituals or reminders. I mean their perpetual use of moral platitude. The huge popularity of such works is really commensurate and coincident with the fact that England has lost its religion. Reading Miss Corelli's novels is really a sort of substitute for going to church, a very inadequate substitute, as I willingly concede. But it is really unreasonable to complain that such books are full of cheap and obvious sentiment, for so any religious service must necessarily be. The sane and healthy man has a right to ask for oddities in his riddles, and he has a right also to ask for truisms in his religion. The real explanation for the popularity of books I therefore maintain to be this, that the books perform certain functions which books were never meant to perform at all. And if the books truly fulfill other functions, it is really unfair to ask them if they also fulfill the function of books. A man reads a detective novel because he cannot induce the old nurse to tell him any really long riddle. He reads a horsey novel because he has no horse to ride, or perhaps, having one, does not know which end to climb up. He reads warlike novels because his country has not been at war seriously for a century. And he reads religious novels because his country is perishing for lack of religion. End of section 2. End of G.K. Chesterton and the Bibliophile Magazine by G.K. Chesterton.